A lot of times what I was seeing is people posting on social media of like, leadership is good, management is bad, and be a leader, don't be a manager. And so it was this dichotomy of management was the lesser of the two. And I said, that hasn't been my experience. And organizations that really work well, management's actually where I think the secret sauce happens.
This is the Entrepreneurs United podcast with your hosts, John St. Pierre and Rich Hoffman.
Hey, fellow entrepreneurs, today we are going to have a conversation with Matt Lay. Matt's a senior consultant and also authored the book, Manage Your Gaps, Reclaiming the Awesomeness of Management. Matt, thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here.
Matt, let's talk about the awesomeness of management. Let's just start with that particular point specifically. Sometimes entrepreneurs get in their business starts growing, they hire more people, and then they come home every day stressed, dreading the next day, problems start happening, things start going on, and they maybe stop loving management, loving leadership. Is that kind of what you mean by reclaiming awesomeness of management?
Yeah, that's part of it. And it works all the way up to large organizations where they've got established structure and manager roles and all of it. But particularly, actually, it does get felt at the entrepreneurial level. And where I'm coming at it is a lot of times what I was seeing is people posting on social media of like, leadership is good, management is bad, and be a leader, don't be a manager. And so it was this dichotomy of management was the lesser of the two. And I said, that hasn't been my experience. And organizations that really work well, management's actually where I think the secret sauce happens, because I think management's where your culture champions are. Management's the pass-off point between the doers and the thinkers. So if you get that right, that's what really unlocks your organization. And particularly for startups, you start with an idea, right? You've got a vision, totally the leadership space. And then you've got a solution. You've got some product, you've got a thing that you're doing, totally the contribution space. You continue to grow. People like what you're doing. They love the vision. And so you get more and more people in the mix. And eventually you get to this inflection point where all of those management activities that you're taking on need to be coalesced into a manager role. And recognizing where that point is, I think that's where a lot of that friction that you described before is coming from, is we haven't done a good job of helping people understand where the leader role and the manager role fit into an organization. And then also separating between roles and activities. Just because you are a leader doesn't mean you're only engaged in leadership. You still need to do management. You still need to do contribution. It's figuring out what's your mix and then what's your organization designed to help address the actual issues that the organization is experiencing.
How would you bullet point what is management and what is leadership in, say, a sentence?
Management is down and in, leadership out and up.
Got it. Elaborate a touch there.
Yeah. So the role of leadership is to define where the value will be in the future. The role of management is to optimize where the value is today.
Speak to your experience with both and how you came to realize, management's kind of getting disparaged, but it's needed. Where was that gap that you experienced in your world?
That's a really great question. Career path, I actually started out in ministry. I went to seminary. I was a Lutheran pastor. I led a small congregation. So I had gotten that leadership space, did well with it, and was very comfortable being a leader. Got curious, stepped into the corporate environment, ended up working in purchasing and supply chain operations, and was a contributor. And I had a lot of enjoyment, tasking, getting things done, creating efficiencies, all of that. And so I got promoted to be a manager. And in my mind, it's like, oh, I've been a leader. I'm rocking it as a contributor. Manager, it's just a middle in between the two. And I had a bridge with two solid foundations, and I got to the middle and it was like paved in paper. And I felt like I was going to fall through into the icy waters beneath every minute of every day. I was freaking out that my people didn't like me. Was I making the right choices? And so that experience of, wait a minute, I've done both of these, but this thing in the middle is different. Why do I have skill sets on both sides, but I'm really struggling in the middle? That was about a decade ago. And really, it's been teasing out the differences between those roles. So the book is basically the culmination of my own journey, having experienced that management versus leadership are different activities. And being really good at leadership doesn't necessitate or qualify you necessarily to be really good at management, and vice versa.
So, what is the experience of too much management? What does that look like where you go, that's too much management and you can actually use some more leadership skill? And then what is the experience of too much leadership where you could actually use some management skills? So, either one could be over leveraged. Can you just describe for an entrepreneur, how would they identify if they're over leveraging management or if they're over leveraging leadership, and what the door out is?
Yeah, a real simple way of dividing those out is leadership is the innovation side of the equation, and management is the optimization side of it. And that's something that every company wants to do, right? You want to innovate, you want to optimize. And that's constantly a tension. And I make a distinction between problems, which are things that we can solve. They have a solution, and tensions, which are things that we actually, to use the phrase again, but we manage. We have to determine where are we at on the scale. If you're over led, you're over optimized. You're over innovating. You're not optimizing anything. You keep coming up with lots of really great new solutions. You're building the future, but all of a sudden you realize you've got slightly inefficient pieces. Nothing scales. It becomes heavier, more burdensome. You need some more management. If you're constantly optimizing the thing you have, but you're hitting those growth ceilings and you're not getting any bigger, everything's working efficiently, but you just haven't been able to land the next client or make things work a little bit better, then you're probably missing that leadership. You're missing that innovation. So that tension is where I would say you can tap into, are you over leveraged into leadership or over leveraged into management? And then another one, which is a in between. I read a really great article called The Three Boxes, and it's innovation, optimization, but the third box is, what are you going to let go of? And that's a space where leadership and management come together, which I call like the X factor. If leadership is out and up, that's the top half of the X. Management is down and in, that's the bottom half of the X. That middle space where leadership and management touch, that's the space where you think about what can we let go of in the optimization or innovation bucket so we can put our energies into the next thing. Because that's a bucket a lot of times, especially entrepreneurs, we lose because we say yes to everything to start off because we got to take all the business, we got to make that money. And we end up with a big bucket of stuff that's either not optimized or we're not innovating. And we need to let go of some of it so we can move on to what's next.
And I'm imagining this between optimization and innovation is probably not like a light switch. In other words, there's not a company that's all optimization and then flip a light switch on and now you're all innovation. It's more like a slider scale. And it might be smart for an entrepreneur to know which side of the scale are you on? Where's the slider? And then always be looking to move it more towards the middle. Mm-hmm. So if that's the case, if there was someone who wanted to move things more towards the middle and they were way on the innovation side, how would they go about getting skilled up or educated more about management? And then obviously my question is going to be the inverse of how do you recommend somebody go about and get skilled up in leadership if they're too much on the optimization side?
Yeah. So if they're too much on the innovation side, I created a model for management called EPIC, which stands for Environment, Performance, Identity, Communication. And really that environment performance, that's the realm of management, learning what is the scope, where's the process, where are we leveraging the right tools, our tech stack, and where are we creating efficiencies? That's your environment space. And then for performance, it's what are our goals? Because goals are for growth. And what are our metrics? Metrics are for maintenance or maintaining the consistency that we have. How are we trending? And how are we helping other people grow individually in their own career or life paths? Because one of those other pieces that I think management and leadership both bring to the table is that concept I have called fulfillment ROI, which is that everyone wants to feel fulfilled in what you're doing, but that's a very unique journey. The formula is actually pretty simple. Is the amount of energy you're investing in things less than the amount of value that produces for you? And that can both be the energy investment of time, of actually doing it, the energy investment of stress, energy internally, and it can be what do you produce either as a value that's extrinsic, product or service, and intrinsic, that you feel that you're in alignment with who you are. So if that's giving you a return, that's a fulfilling experience. And that's a space where management can really help. So if you feel like you're over leveraged into innovation, helping set up your environment and measuring your performance can really help you get back into that optimization space. If you're over leveraged into the optimization, That's a little bit more tricky because it's less system versus, because you need people to do the innovation and optimization that are skilled for it. If you're missing the optimization, that might be hiring in someone else. Or if you have a good thought partner, having them come in and just look and do it like a strategic offsite. That's probably the biggest piece of advice I'd give is step away from the business to think about the business. One of my favorite assessments is The Working Genius by Patrick Lencioni. And so in that, he talks about the 6 phases of anything getting done. So there's wonder and invention, which is the ideation phase. Then there's discernment and galvanizing, which is the activation phase. Then there's enablement and tenacity, which is the implementation phase. So if you as a leader are wired more towards that activation and implementation, but not towards that ideation, that would be a space where you find a partner who is more wired to those spaces to come in and help you see what's possible with what you already have. So I would say probably need to partner into that if you're not wired for it. And if you're not experiencing it, I would assume you're probably not for it.
Matt, just a quick heads up that my sheet's already full of notes. You're providing like a tremendous amount of content here. And I know where I want to go first, but there's a lot of great stuff here. So thank you right off the bat. Rich and I always love it when we have like pages of notes from a conversation because we know that we're sharpening our saw in the moment as well. We gotten here. Here's why I'm saying this. I have a few entrepreneurs that I work with that are struggling with this exact thing because their people want a leader. They don't want a manager. They don't want a micromanager. They don't want somebody who's going to hold them accountable. They want someone who's going to rah-rah lead them. They're not comfortable with conflict. Have we gotten too soft? If you go back 20 years ago and you look at the management styles of GE or some of these companies that were really production machines, it was a different climate. And then all of a sudden in the past like couple of decades, it's like leadership. You got to be a good leader. You got to be a good leader. And I think that leaders today, managers today, don't know how to be a manager anymore because they feel like their team wants them to be such a leader and they're trying to learn all these leadership skills and they stop forgetting how to hold people accountable and how to motivate them and challenge them and address conflict and all these things have perished. And so I know a lot of entrepreneurs today are really struggling with this because they're afraid to have conversations with their team because they don't want to be perceived as the manager. How did we get here? And how can someone correct their trajectory?
That's a really great question. And I think part of the reason we got here is to what I started with, to an extent, what we put on social media is we lift up leadership and we denigrate management. And what do we do with all of our hypos, our high potential, high performing individuals? We put them on leadership tracks and they take on all the projects where they're growing something. And those type of people end up rising to the top. And all of a sudden they're in the top leadership position, but they've never learned actual management skills. And then that's where they start to see the struggle. For an entrepreneur, nobody starts out, in a sense, being really great at management to start a business. You have to have a really great vision, which is a leadership quality. And you have to have a really great product, which is a contribution quality. Management doesn't necessarily come into the picture until you've grown because of the success of those other two pieces. And so it becomes a secondary skill set for a lot of people. And one of the spaces I would say this probably falls more into the leadership bucket than the management space, actually. Another one of those tensions I talk about is having leadership of standards or leadership of support. And people tend to fall into one of those two sides of the sliding scale, as Rich put it before, where personally, I'm a leader of support. Like I like to be the person's, you know what, I saw the effort, you put it out there. That was great. It was B+, but there was a lot of other things going on. I got your back. You're doing great. If I lean just into that support style, which is where I think a lot of the trend is where we're asking people to be when we think about management from that leadership space, you get into like, well, it doesn't really matter what I do. Matt's just going to tell me I'm awesome anyways. So where's the effort? The other side of that is the standards. One of my favorite people in this was one of my coaches. I played ultimate Frisbee in college and he was our captain. And his name was Brian. And it didn't matter if we were up by 13. If he thought we should have been up by 14, he would be throwing his hat in the ground, swearing a blue streak in your face saying, you've got more. You could put more on the line. I know you've got that. That sometimes sucked in the moment because it's like, Brian, I'm putting everything I have out there. Stop busting my chops. But at the end of the day, I knew that Brian knew I had more out there. And so what Brian was doing, he was calling more out of me. But the other side of that is if you're just leaning into that standard space, it's also the same thing happens. What difference does it make? It doesn't matter how hard I try. Brian's never going to be happy. He did have the ability to step back and celebrate when you did really well. So he had some support. So he had that balance. I think a lot of times what we're worried about is that people just want us to be the support style leader in the way we engage with them, that we don't lean into the standards. And I'd say figuring out how to pull that into the mix, because frankly, people do better when you see in them something that they don't necessarily see in themselves yet. You still got to have emotional intelligence, but I think that's one of the things that's missing.
Yeah. And I totally now get the subtitle of your book, Reclaiming the Awesomeness of Management. It's lost. We've become too soft. And people hear the word leadership and they just go in this direction. You're right. Social media, whatever it may be, it's glamorized, right? Being a leader, being a mentor, it's all glamorized. Then you have companies that aren't hitting their goals. People are not feeling this sense of challenge or whatever. And I know, Rich, you and I have always talked about sometimes relationships are built through conflict over time, not just spending time with each other, but through challenge. And I know my biggest mentors are the ones who challenged me, called me to the carpet, just like Brian did, threw the hat on the ground going, you can do better than this, and challenged me. But then I always felt nice and rosy going into the leaders meeting that pumped me up, but they're not my best mentors today. I felt good in the moment. So there's this little bit of what's best for the team, what's best for the manager at play that I think we need to bring back and re-educate managers on. No, you can be both in the right moment. You can be a manager here and a leadership here. And I actually started designing a little bit of a grid. And maybe you have a grid in your book, because I started designing like the grid. Okay, if you're management, you're down and in, you value today, you're focused on optimization. If you're into leadership and you're focusing on that at the moment, you're out and up, you're valuing the future, innovation. Here's my question. How would you recommend a manager today who's been struggling with their style of switching between the management and the leadership? Maybe they're spending a little bit too much time on the leadership side, not enough time on the management side. How do they make that pivot beyond reading your book, which hopefully they'll do? What are some actionable tips to say, okay, you need a pivot. Here's how you start. Here's what you should do right now. If you've been too far over on the leadership side, you got to reclaim management. 1, 2, 3. What is it? What are the steps?
Yeah. First and foremost, I would say focus in on that environment. Do people have clarity on what they're doing? Scope. That's where a lot of good intentions get met with negative perceptions, is that not having clarity on who does what. Then success. Because what scope gives you is a definition of what people do, and success is a measurement of it. And it's really hard to feel fulfilled if you can't feel successful. It's really hard to feel successful if you have no measurement of success. And it's really hard to measure something you haven't defined what it is. So setting up environment and scope is defining it. Success measurements of metrics and goals help you to measure that. And then that feeling of success, celebrating that and helping people know how they're doing against it. Because I'm a firm believer people don't really mind being a cog in the wheel if they, one, know what the cog does for the wheel and really care about where the wheel is going, which means you have to tell them. So I'll simplify it down. If you want 4 things you want to ask yourself a question on, I call this the 4 C's. Are you showing people you care? Are you giving them clarity? Are you being consistent? And are you communicating that? And then are you communicating that? And then are you communicating that? Because it's about the time we start getting tired of saying something that people start to actually hear it. Care, clarity, consistency. And it should be over communication, but then the alliteration gets lost. So it's just communication. I just say it more times.
I love it. Care, clarity, consistent, communicate. And you mentioned earlier the epic, and you went back to environment as one of the first things as well, which for a minute there, I felt like maybe I asked you a question you already answered, which is, yeah, it's epic. Environment, performance, improvement, communication. Did I get that right?
Identity.
Okay. You gave us a good amount on environment. Thank you. I have clarity, role, success, celebrate. Like, what's your environment? And I have performance, was goals, metrics, trending. Where are you trending? Growth. What would you say some sub-bullets of identity are and some sub-bullets of communication so I can fill my chart out?
Sure. Yeah. And I could send you I have a whole wheel, like the 16 subsections of it, but identity is around get your why. Why are you doing this? What purpose does this serve? If you're, say, being a manager, is this because you get paid more money? You know what? That's actually a scarcity goal, because money is just a means. It's not an end. You want more money so that you have to start answering like those 5 why type questions to get to really what is your why. Emotional intelligence, extremely important. Like that, if there's a particular skill set, one, because it's growable, you can actually improve your emotional intelligence. So EQI 2.0 is my go-to assessment for that. But understanding what is your emotional intelligence, understanding what is your fit. So that could be any type of behavioral or cognitive assessments, maybe even some of it being cognitive, but looking at what is the role and who am I? And then how much alignment in that Venn diagram is there? Is who I am and then my role, or there's very little overlay? That's going to be a pretty big struggle for you to find yourself in that role. So your identity is going to be a tension point. And then the last piece is articulation. Just what is your identity? What is management to you? And what is management to your organization? If you can't define that, then again, back to what I said before, it's really hard to feel successful in something you can't articulate. So your identity, being able to articulate that's really important. Communication then goes to one, what are the different channels? Because we tend to over leverage 2 channels, meetings and emails, but there are so many different, nobody communicates unless they have something to say. Communication is about meeting people's needs. Do you need to inform them? Do you need them to do something for you? Do you need to have a discussion? Figure out what those needs are helps you really articulate or to identify what channel to use. So that's the first step. Then for managers specifically, I say meetings and one-on-ones are 2 really important communication channels. You have to understand what they're used for and how to leverage them. Then the last piece of communication for the model is listening. What is the difference between being an active listener, which I actually put in the middling category, and then being a global listener, which is a lot of times when we move people from, you got to stop communicating and listening just to talk to, like when they take a breath, you need to be an active listener, which is, can I articulate back to you what you just said to me? There's actually a step beyond that, which is the global listening, which is the sense of we're both here. So we both have something to bring to the table. So the goal is by the end of this conversation, something more exists than before the conversation. And I'm a part of that. So I'm not just an active listener parroting back to you what you said, so that by the end of the conversation, we both have clarity on what you said. I'm an active participant adding something to the conversation so that I'm looking to grow this because I'm taking everything into account. It's a global listening method. So that communication is channels, meetings, one-on-ones, and then listening.
Meetings and one-on-ones. How do you know you're doing them well? What's the point of them?
Start with one-on-ones because I think that is the touch point of management. That is not a leadership role. That is 100% a management space. And I write about it in the book, but that was the most important meeting on my calendar. I would cancel meetings with my leaders if they conflicted with my one-on-ones. Those are contributors meeting. They own that space. It's all about them. It's not about the manager. It's where are you at on your trajectory? It's not a drive-by, give me information quick. It's not about what can I take from you to get to leadership. It's a check in with the person for their own growth. And if you continue to do that on a touch point, it's almost like a mini stay interview on a regular basis of how are you doing growing in the company and growing as an individual? How could we leverage this role for your growth? That's the space for one-on-ones. So it's really focused on the individual contributor or the direct report. One, there's no such thing as an informative meeting. There's a terrible channel for information. Like you don't need to pull people together to share something that could either be an email, PDF printed out on a board. There's multiple different ways to do that. Meetings are really for 2 purposes. They're for making decisions and having discussions. And really breaking them out into those categories is important. What type of meeting are we having? Because it's really frustrating to show up to a discussion meeting thinking you're going to make a decision. And it's annoying to show up to a decision meeting thinking you were just going to have a discussion. That's why it's important to have an agenda. I think as simple as just having a purpose statement in the body when you send out the email. And then honestly, the biggest one is I love like no agenda. Give people the freedom. If you don't put an agenda in the meeting, I don't have to attend it. Make that a rule. Make that a norm. And then 2, Make it okay for people to ask, I don't understand why we're meeting. Why do I need to be here? Because of the same thing could happen is to say, oh, you know what? We actually need 2 other people because now I know the agenda and we have the right people in the room for the right meetings. And then the last piece I'll say, ask for feedback. I don't care if it's a 3x5 card at the end where you just get asked for a 1 to 5 rating with a statement if they have it. Pass those out every time. Make that a norm. Ask for feedback on how the meeting went. I guarantee you, your meetings will get better over time. You might cry in a corner for a while for the first few sessions. It's the type of feedback you need to make it better.
I have a question just on the no informative meetings, which I subscribe to. There's so many things you can do. Asynchronous video, you can do a whole bunch of different things. But then one of the epics is communication. One of the 4 C's is communicating. And sometimes you send out an asynchronous video to your team, they don't read it. You send them a long email, they don't read it. They got too many things going on. So the only way you can actually get them to listen is you pull them into a room and go, here's what's going on. And it's informative. Do you say even then, John, no, that's not the way to do it?
Yeah, I would, at the end of the day, I would say that's a tail wagging the dog. You're addressing a symptom, not a root cause. The root cause of that issue is people just aren't valuing the communication that's already out there. People need to be held accountable for the things they need to be held accountable for. So you can, if you're going to shift something like this, I definitely am all for trial periods to say, hey, by the way, we are moving to this. And once we get past like the 30-day or 60, 90, however big the change is, mark, this is where it's going to come up. And if people aren't showing up for the pieces, hey, that's not on the system and that's not on the manager. And that's frankly one of those spaces more for larger corporations, but top cover from leadership to support that. Because a lot of times where that ends up coming up is the management doesn't feel like they're supported by the leadership. And so they're like, my people are doing what they're supposed to do. And the leadership's like, that's on you, make them do the thing. And they're not listening to communication. So now I try and come up with a new way. Now I'm in an informative meeting. Not a big fan of absolutes. So I would say never is a word I probably won't use very often. So if it's where you're at, you've got to make it work. But just know that where the root cause is not the having the informative meeting. It's something different.
Yeah, I love that.
A moment ago, you talked about getting clarity on who does what and a measurement of success. Do you have a tool that you refer to or a method that you recommend a team or an individual use to get that clarity?
So on the metrics side, I think KPIs is just classic and key performance indicators. I think every role should have 3 to 5, not less than 3 and not more than 5, because either you're not measuring enough or you're measuring too much, because both are not great. But one of the things you should ask is, if this position did everything I expected it to, what would be the outcome? How would I know? How would I be able to tell someone you've been successful in your role? You are providing for the company what we expected you to provide for the company. Every role has that. Otherwise, why the hell do we have the role? Then if that's true, then we can start setting some KPIs and that metrics. That's the maintenance. When you're looking at growth, I like OKRs, objectives and key results, because when they're done well, they ladder up to the vision and the mission. So that is one piece that gives them clarity. I'm cool with SMART goals. I think that's great. The biggest thing that I would do if I do a SMART goals is there's this overlay you can put on them that's called AIM. So you want to aim SMART. And what that stands for is acceptable, ideal, and middle. And the reason for that is a lot of times we set SMART goals and they're lines in the sand. So next quarter, we're going to land 25 new clients. Okay, you landed 24. Did you succeed in your goal? Technically, no, but you were so close. How do we deal with that? If we set that up as an AIM goal, SMART goal, then it's what's acceptable. You know what? 15, I think, let's say 20. 20 is an acceptable goal. Ideal, 40. Man, that's awesome. We would rock it. How much stretch do we want to put into it today? How much energy do you think we have next quarter? I think not a lot. Let's go 25. 25 is what I'm shooting for, but 20 is acceptable. 40 is knocking it out of the park. Now that 24, okay, we have a different conversation. We hit the acceptable goal. We were really close to the middle. What do we think was going on? How can we tweak this the next time we're out there? Were we unrealistic? Or was there something else going on in the environment? That changes the way we have a conversation. So if you're going to do a SMART goal, I would recommend putting the AIM overlay to help give you a little bit of a range.
So you would go from objectives to key results and measurable KPI. I think you're further recommending on the KPIs, instead of just SMART goals, use the AIM SMART goals. Am I following your flow correctly?
Yeah, but I'd say the SMART goals and the OKRs, those are in the goals category. So like I'd separate them. Goals are for growth. They're for moving us from a way we're doing it to an ideally better way in the future. So we want to see some change. KPIs are maintenance. Those are metrics. Therefore, what does success look like today? And we want to maintain that level of success. That's the KPI. So in an organization, you could have SMART goals or OKRs in the goals category that grow over time so that your KPIs in the future shift because you've improved your capabilities. So the key performance indicators of maintenance are going to be higher, say next quarter. But what the KPIs are is that's an expected threshold of what success looks like. And sometimes there's two different types. There's thresholds like revenue. Like we expect everyone to pull in $20,000 a quarter. And if you're over 20,000 and you hit 40,000, that's fantastic. But you need to be over the threshold. There are other ones where capacity based, that they're bullseyes, where we want to produce 150 units a quarter, because then that's 75, 80% utility within our facility. Okay, great. If we're doing 40, that's not enough. If we're doing 240, that's way too many. So we need to also, are we doing a threshold metric or are we doing a bullseye metric is also an important distinction to make.
So I just want to pause and check in. I've never heard or considered KPIs are for maintenance and goals are for growth. Have I just not heard that, or is that something that you're assimilating in your philosophy of performance management?
More of the latter. It's just from like my background, supply chain operations, just how we operated using these pieces. For me, creating a method in my head. What are we doing? Why are we measuring any of this? I started making the distinction between a metric and a goal, but a lot of times those are conflated terms. We use them interchangeably. But I think it's useful to separate them out because goals can then be more in that leadership space. Metrics can be more in that management space, maintaining the consistent versus growing to the, because leadership is moving people from point now to point next. So that's what goals do. Metrics help us maintain the consistency. That's optimization. That's what management does.
And it sounds like that exact same philosophy of how you bucketed things and used these common terms. That's also what you did with the leadership and management. Because I've never really heard, hey, leadership is about innovation, management is optimization. And at first blush, I go, yeah, that makes sense. I see how those can be correlated. I guess I've always looked at leadership as leadership by the pure definition is someone's following. It really doesn't matter if you're a good example, if you're a bad example, if you're an example at all. If you even know if somebody's following, you by definition are leading. If nobody's following, you can't say you're leading. So I've always looked at it in that way and then said, okay, so if people are following, what is the example they're following? That can include innovation, that can include optimization. So I've looked at it more generally you're welcome to respond. I'm not even challenging the way you're using it, but it sounds like the way you've sub-defined these things make them useful for you in a construct to use some of this common language a little further defined is how just your brain works, and what people can enjoy more about your book is how you do that.
And actually, you bring up a really great point, which is I make a distinction between roles and activities. And so if no one's following you, you're not in a leader role. But when you're in a leader role, you need to be engaged in the activities of leadership and the activities of management. And so what I'm doing when I'm teasing them out is I'm teasing out the activities to say, hey, every role is going to be a mix of leadership, management, and contribution. Even if you're a contributor and you have no interest whatsoever of ever being a manager or a leader, you will most likely still be engaged in some management activities, which is optimization of your day-to-day. Maybe you're running a project and you need to optimize the way it's being tracked. And leadership. Maybe you just got out of college, you're a new hire, but what you worked on in college is a system that nobody else in your business has ever worked on before. You'll probably be tapped on the shoulder, ideally, if people are paying attention, to do some leadership activity into that new space. Even though you're a contributor by role, you'll be engaged in some leadership activities. So one of the questions I get into in the book is, what's your mix? What's the mix for you ideally and for your organization for the role that you're in that ideally would best serve the organization at that point? So I think that's a great distinction you called out between the two.
Yeah, I appreciate the way you respond to that too. And in the end, if you're listening to this and you think about your fulfillment ROI equation, are you getting more value out of everything you're doing every day in your business versus the energy you're putting in? And that spoke to me, right? We spent a lot of time away from our families, a lot of stress, is it aligned to what I really love doing from an alignment in my core values or my beliefs and how I want to spend my time? And time's a precious thing. And if you're doing your fulfillment ROI equation and realizing, ugh, I'm upside down, I'm spending way too much time, energy, stress versus the return that I'm getting, you probably need to pick up this book. You probably need to reach out to Matt and probably need to have a conversation. So how does that happen? I know you provide consulting in this area and help entrepreneurs with this kind of juxtaposition between management and leadership. So how can somebody learn more? How can you help entrepreneurs listening to this going, okay, I want more from Matt?
So a couple of things. Always look me up on LinkedIn. That's probably the easiest way just to see what I'm up to. My company that I'm moving into is actually called IPN Advisors moving forward. So it's going to be Inflection Point Nexus Advisors. So you can find that at www.ipnadvisors.com. And actually, I'm going to be to the point with the book. If you go to ipnadvisors.com/EUP, you are going to get the first 3 chapters of the book as a PDF download. So you could just read. That gets into the language. You'll get that piece where I talk about the leadership versus management, the role versus activities. So you get at least the clarification on those pieces. So hopefully that's the value add to start. And if that's all you need, I say keys for free. So that's always my piece. You can figure it out on your own. There's plenty of people that need some help walking through the door. I'm happy to help them, but keys are for free.
Awesome. Thanks for your time today, Matt.
Yeah, this has been great.
Stay tuned as John and Rich unpack today's conversation.
John, the fulfillment ROI reminds me, and I swear I must have told you during lockdown, of the happiness equation. And I think I saw it on Facebook. That happiness equation was expectations minus reality equals your level of happiness. So if your expectations are way too high and you subtract a reality lower than that, you're going to be disappointed. And then obviously if expectations are lower and minus reality, it's actually a positive thing. So it's interesting. This fulfillment ROI does something very similar on energy. How much energy are you putting in minus the value you're realizing from that energy? Hey, is that a positive? You should probably do more of that, or figure out how to get more value, or figure out how to put in less energy to get that same value. So it's a positive net on that equation. Yeah, so, circular kind of with it.
Yeah, there's kind of missing this multiplier effect, even in your happiness quotient. I mean, the happier you are, potentially the more you can do things, the more you'll progress. And this fulfillment ROI can be draining. It goes the other way. The multiplier can be negative. You're putting in more time, you're stressed out, you're not getting the results you want, your fulfillment ROI is going down, it's going down, it's going down. You can lose control. You can lose control to the point where I quit. I don't want to work here anymore. I'm going to just close this company down and go do something else. So this fulfillment ROI is very, very, very important. I think where you and I were struggling without ever talking about it throughout this conversation, and I think he summed it up very, very well to your question, is this what situational leadership is? Sometimes you got to be more directive. Sometimes you can be more of a coach. Sometimes you can be more supportive. Sometimes you got to do different roles in your leadership role, but isn't that what leadership is? I think it was a very valid question. I actually wrote that down very initially on. This is similar to situational leadership. But what I loved about what he did and said was, hold on a second. I think that way too many entrepreneurs, leaders, people, managers, whatever you want to call them, I'm not sure what to call them anymore. I don't want to label them, is they haven't been trained formally in situational leadership. They haven't been trained actually how to be an effective manager, and they haven't been trained on how to be an effective leader. They just feel like they need to show more leadership skills and management skills because that's what they feel their team's going to want more of. And therefore they do that. And then they get a low return on their fulfillment ROI. And then they wonder why things aren't going well at their company. That's how I kind of diagnosed a little bit of this conversation, was the difference between you and I who are trained in situational leadership. We're like, what's the difference? But then you start thinking about people who are actually executing it And there's a big disconnect between when do I need to be a manager and when do I need to be a leader in the way that Matt framed it.
It's funny you bring this up. I was just talking to a potential client yesterday, and one of the things that he asked was, what do you often work on with other entrepreneurs? Like, what do you find yourself always talking about that I can expect we would probably talk about? And I said, situational leadership always comes up, and people getting clarity on how to diagnose someone's skill and commitment and then apply the correct leadership style between directive, coaching, supporting, and delegating. I said, that always comes up. The other one is setting expectations and holding accountability. So it's interesting, as you brought that up, I'm thinking, wow, the setting expectations and holding accountability, I think Matt might put in the management bucket, and that comes up often. And then the situational leadership also comes up often. That's more, although situational leadership, you could say is not, in his framework, it's not necessarily about innovation. I wonder where Matt would land on that. I'd love to ask him, would he see situational leadership as a management approach? Because I'm not sure it leads to innovation, though. And delegating, yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Because eventually that leads to...
Correct.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, because when you get to the spectrum where you are delegating, you're setting goals, you're looking in the future, and you're saying, okay, go, Rich, you can do this. Like, you got this. So I do feel that in situational leadership, you go through those different spectrums, but it's not as clear. It's not as clear as the way we defined it here a little bit today. And I do really feel that we have a big problem. I love what you said. In a lot of the entrepreneurs that I coach, situational leadership always comes up. It always comes up.
Yes. You were asking Matt about the informing. And is there ever a time where in meetings, like, look, let me just give you the information, because people aren't reading emails and people are watching asynchronous videos. And Matt's answer was, it's the tail wagging the dog. You've got to, at some point, hold accountability to people absorbing the communication. I will tell you, John, my experience with this has been a bit painful, is getting people to either read or watch videos. Here's the painful part of it, is when you make a transition to clean up communication and informing outside of meetings, you're going to have to accept there are people who are not going to consume it, and it will create a pain point. You can't save them once you've drawn the line in the sand and give them other channels of communication. So to make sure they get it, you've got to be willing to have the painful experience of somebody didn't know something they should have. They may even be a little bit upset that they were embarrassed that they didn't know that, or they missed an opportunity to hit a certain timeline, but it was communicated in the method you told them it would be communicated in. That's the painful part. You can't come back and save them. Almost everybody has to experience having missed something in that new form of communication in order to discipline themselves to actually consume that new form of communication moving forward, because they don't want to miss it again. And they probably only retain 50% of it.
They retain a certain percentage of it anyway. So you have the same problem if you bring people together. But I love your point. A few years ago, we did a company survey, and the survey was, we don't communicate enough as a company. We don't tell people what's going on. Okay, fine. We are going to communicate. We are going to have a monthly meeting with everybody, like 100 and some people in the company. We're going to have a monthly meeting. We're going to get on. We're going to communicate. Then we're going to send them a newsletter of everything we communicated. And we just hit them up like left and right to or communicate, Matt was talking about. But you make a really good point. He made a really good point as well, which is if people aren't reading what you're sending out, or they're not listening to the video you're sending out, maybe that's more of the problem. Maybe your videos are 3 hours long when they could have been 15 minutes. Maybe the content in it doesn't mean anything to them. It's not relevant to them and their roles. So you actually look at diagnosing the problem, not the symptom. And so the root cause, right? So that was really informative to me. And I think the usage of asynchronous video today, the way to get people, even with technology today, to send somebody to even a site where they can answer a few questions to show they got the learning and hit complete, and everybody completed it. There's a whole bunch of different ways to make sure that information is put out to the information distributed. But a lot of it is you have to communicate. You have to over communicate, but don't do it by meeting. No agenda, no attenda.
Yeah, I like that. Had you heard of Aim Smart? I had not. as I thought about aim smart, and it's acceptable, ideal, and then in the middle. So you're determining what's the minimum level of performance, if you will, what's the ideal level of performance. And then given our scenario today, given the current day circumstance, what's actually the place in the middle where we want to get? I think you and I use a form of this. The form of it that we use is simply setting a goal and having a BHAG. So the goal ends up, and where we're aligned with Matt, the goal ends up in the middle. We're not going to accept minimum performance. We want something above minimum performance. Matt's calling that the middle. And then ideal would be what you and I would typically use as a BHAG. So it's interesting. At first it was like, oh, this is new. And it was like, oh, that's very similar.
What's interesting is I think sometimes goals are limiting because people want to set a goal they know they can hit. And so they don't set the BHAG or they don't set the aim level. They set the, here's what I'm going to go do. So they don't try and achieve more. So that's what I like about the aim is you can set comfortably. Here's what I love to do. If I did this, would be kick ass, right? Like I want to go after that. But at a minimum level, I want to make sure I get this right. And inevitably, I think what ends up happening is people do hit the middle. And if they don't at least hit the minimum, now you got a lot of questions. If they hit the middle, you go, okay, what could we have done differently to hit the top one? So I think it stretches you a little bit more than the typical, give me one number of how many appointments you're going to have next week. I think it stretches the view of it a little bit more and creates a little more conversation in a comfortable environment. So I love that.